So how stupid is the left's agenda with regard to the anti-science nonsense pushed by the transgender movement? This is an actual tweet from New York Times Science. The idea that a person's sex is determined by their anatomy at birth is not true, and we've known that it's not true for decades. Okay? Well, realistically speaking, I suppose that's not true only in the most narrow sense. It is determined by chromosomes, right? It's determined by genetics, and theoretically you could have some sort of birth malformation when you are born that leaves you bereft of the genitalia that match up with your actual genetics. So I guess in the very narrowest sense it's true, but the idea that means that sex is on a spectrum among humans is just stupid. I love this headline though. Anatomy does not determine gender, experts say. Right, genetics determines gender. I love this. Researchers who have studied gender issues and provided healthcare to people who do not fit the typical male-female pigeonholes, as though they are just created by society, said that the Trump administration's latest plan to define gender goes beyond the limits of scientific knowledge. The idea that a person's sex is determined by their anatomy at birth is not true, and we've known that it is not true for decades, says Joshua Safer, an endocrinologist and the executive director of the Center for Transgender Medicine and Surgery, of course, at the Mount Sinai Health System in New York. You want to talk about ascientific stuff? Okay, talk about whether there are beneficial effects to transgender surgeries over time. Okay, there is not good evidence to suggest that the end effect over the course of decades is actually significantly superior to no surgery, and yet this has become part of the transgender movement shtick. Now, let me be clear. We live in a free country. You want to go carve up your own genitals? That's your problem. Right? You can find a surgeon who's willing to do that for you. Go for it. It's a free country. But let's not pretend that the science is on the side of all of the claims that are being made. I love this. Buried down in this article, they say, genetics does play a role, though. Oh, you think. So it's by the way, you know how you know that it's not just genitalia? Because if a male were to have his twig and berries physically removed in some sort of accident, he would still be a male. Yet if he intends to do so in a surgery, we are now supposed to consider him a female. Okay, that is not logical. I want to talk for just a second about the sort of propaganda that's been promoted on this issue. And it really is insane propaganda. So the notion that is pushed by the left that transgenderism is not a mental disorder is completely ascientific. Okay, now what the left does is they like to cite things like the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, because the DSM-5 suggests that gender identity disorder is no longer a mental disorder. Instead, what the DSM-5 says is that a mental disorder is a, quote, syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental functioning. Now, this is the funny part. Socially deviant behavior and conflicts that are primarily between the individual and society are not mental disorders unless the deviance or conflict results from a dysfunction in the individual as described above. So in other words, if you have something that makes you think that a pink elephant is stalking you, unless this makes you feel bad, this is not actually a mental disorder, according to the DSM. The definition it's making clear room for politically correct posturing, right? If I am having a significant problem in and of myself, all I have to do is blame it on society's intolerance, and it is no longer considered a mental disorder. Okay, so if you are suicidal because you're a man who believes he's a woman, the DSM can still find a way to blame that on society. All you have to say is the reason I'm suicidal is because people are mean to me in society, not because I've suffered with this terrible conflict inside my brain for my entire life. Right now, it's society's fault. This is how the DSM-5 avoids the obvious implication that if you're a man who believes you're a woman, you have a mental disorder. By the way, if you're a fat person who believes you are skinny, or a skinny person who believes you are fat, we all acknowledge you have a mental disorder. If you're a skinny person who believes you are fat, it's called anorexia. It's dangerous and it's a mental disorder. If you're a person who believes that you do not need a left arm, right, this is something called body dysmorphia. This is a mental disorder. But if you're a man who believes you're a woman and you don't need your penis, then it's not a mental disorder. It's society's fault. You explain that one to me. Okay, none of this has anything to do with science. And all of it is specifically designed to blame society for what is clearly and obviously a mental disorder. The reason that I'm serious about calling it a mental disorder, and the reason I do so, is because you can't actually treat a mental disorder by blaming it on society. If you want to come up with new treatments for mental disorder, the way to do that is not by saying that society at large is responsible for the discomfort of people suffering from the mental disorder. I'm somebody who takes mental illness extraordinarily seriously. My grandfather was either bipolar or schizophrenic. There's some lines that are hard to sort of diagnose there. He was institutionalized when my dad was a child. He thought the radio was talking to him. He thought the curtains were trying to strangle him. He suffered from that. That was not something where if we had blamed society's intolerance and just said, you know what, Nate, the radio actually is talking to you. It's just society can't hear what you hear. That would have been foolish. They gave him lithium and he was much better. That does not mean there's a good treatment for gender identity disorder, gender dysphoria, but to pretend that the treatments are all available and that transitioning is the only available sort of fix and that everything else is society's fault is anti-scientific in the extreme. And to quote the DSM, which is a political football and has been in political football for decades, as the sort of apotheosis of scientific knowledge, is just silly. It's just silly. The definition of mental disorder itself is not scientific according to the DSM-5. There's no way that you can pose a hypothesis and then debunk it. It is not scientifically verifiable.